Well, welcome everybody to this Towers of Faith seminar evening. It's a glorious evening here in London. I hope the weather is kind to you as well. Tonight we are very privileged to welcome Professor John Milbank, who is a very well-known and prestigious theologian, to speak on Sergei Nikolaevich Bulgakov, who was a Russian Orthodox theologian, priest, philosopher, and economist. He was elected to the Duma. He was a professor in Church Law and Theology and helped to found l'Institut de Théologie Orthodoxe Saint-Serge in Paris. He is a complex character, apparently, who lived during a particularly turbulent period of Russian history and faced accusations of heresy for his teaching on sophiology. And he has been seen as anticipating the approach of Radical Orthodoxy, of which, of course, John Milbank is well known as the founder. Professor Milbank's work crosses disciplinary boundaries, integrating subjects such as systematic theology, social theory, aesthetics, philosophy, political
as well,
and political theology. I don't think he wants to go to Essex. I hope I'm not insulting any Essex people here, because I'm one of them, so it's it's fine.
Yeah, well, Milbank's from Essex ultimately. where
Professor Milbank first gained recognition
about
of Theology and Social Theory in 1990, which laid the theoretical foundations for the movement which later became known as Radical Orthodoxy. And he's named the Russian sophiological tradition, particularly the work of Sergej Bulgakov, as an intellectual ally. And an interest in him has been a developing interest of his since at least 2002. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Professor Milbank now to speak to us all on Sergej Bulgakov. Thank you very much for being with us, Professor.
No, not at all. And thank you very much for giving me the chance to talk about Bulgakov, and for you all being with me here this evening. As has already been said, Bulgakov is an astonishing figure in all sorts of ways. He was born in 1871 and died in 1944, just before the war had ended. And he lived a very migratory life. He was brought up in a family that was very, very close to the Russian Orthodox Church. Some of you probably read Mikhail Bulgakov's The Master and Margarita. And Mikhail was some sort of remote relation of Sergei. And the whole family had for generations been very close to the Russian Orthodox Church. So Bulgakov was brought up in the faith, but he lost his faith when he was young, and he became a Marxist, a member of the Duma, as has been said. And there is even extant a pamphlet by Lenin denouncing the errors of Comrade Bulgakov. But at that stage, these were relatively secular and Marxist errors. He gradually drifted back towards the faith without ever abandoning his socialism, but his socialism took an increasingly anti-materialist, spiritualist, and Christian form. So he had to flee Russia during the Bolshevik Revolution. He went to Prague, and then he went to Paris, as already been mentioned, and he frequently flipped across the Channel to Oxford to address the Fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius, or also at its base in Hertfordshire. So he was familiar with this country, and Anglicans were talking to Bulgakov quite a lot before the First World War, so Second World War. So he's by no means an alien figure. And trying to understand him, it's very important to realize that he belonged to the so-called Silver Age of Russian culture. The Golden Age is the age of Pushkin, the age of Romanticism. the Silver Age is an era associated with a kind of late Romanticism, in particular with symbolism. And in all sorts of ways, Russian culture is not like our culture at all. And from a theological point of view, I think the main thing to be aware of is that there just isn't kind of our division between religious and secular culture. There isn't, or there wasn't, you know, before the revolution, there wasn't our sort of division between philosophy and theology. And the kind of dualities that theology, Catholic theology, especially in the 20th century, is questioned between grace and nature, between reason and revelation. The Russians never really had these dualities. I mean, you can see also in Russian novels, I think, in Dostoevsky or Tolstoy, that it's very much a religious culture that they're assuming, even though it's also a secular culture. And one of the remarkable things about this Russian background is that theology was very much at the heart of culture. So I've already talked about symbolism, the symbolist movement. When that came to Russia, it was immediately appropriated in a very theological way. So I think that often in the West, theologians feel they're getting things at second hand. You know, there is philosophy and they're influenced by philosophy and they try to relate themselves to contemporary philosophy. In the Russia that Bulgakov emerged from, that wasn't true. The avant-garde thinkers, people like Pavel Florensky, were already theologians. You know, they were right there at the heart of things. And often this means when you read their work now, they feel astonishingly contemporary. It's as if they've already anticipated, for example, lots of postmodernist themes. And even at a practical level, people like Solovyev were already talking about questions about gender and people who don't conform sexually long before these issues arose in the West. I think that's just a rather interesting example to note. And yet at the same time, we're talking about an incredibly exotic universe, a bit like a Dostoevsky novel, really, where, you know, the very, very ancient world of the monastery is also close by. So that Bulgakov was incredibly affected by the disputes going on, particularly around the monks of Mount Athos, around the name of Jesus. That these arguments bear some kind of relationship, some kind of parallel to the older debates about icons. You know, should you worship icons? The arguments about the name of Jesus, about the so-called Jesus prayer, were to do with, is the name of Jesus somehow identical with God? And the real extremists here, the kind of, as it were, the idolaters of the name of Jesus, which included a certain Mr. Rasputin, by the way, obviously they were going too far, but nonetheless, the more moderate party defended the idea that because of the incarnation, the name of Jesus is in some special sense identified with God. It's not God, but in some sense it's identified with God, just as Jesus's humanity was identified with God. So that in saying the Jesus prayer over and over again, you're united to God. Bulgakov saw this as a kind of theurgical action, something really quite close almost to a kind of magical action. And the astonishing thing is that these very kind of traditional seeming theological arguments around spirituality were quite close to these quite sophisticated debates about the symbol, about the philosophy of language that were going on in Russian universities. There's a cross-fertilization going on that is rather unimaginable, I think, from our point of view. And it's remarkable to realize that on the very, very eve of the revolution, the Tsar was almost as preoccupied with the arguments over the so-called name worshippers as he was over the Bolshevik danger. And you know, there were ships sent to the Mount Athos monastery. It was all mixed up with the politics of Greece and so on. And there were actual violence resulted. So it's important to keep that question of the debates about the name and about language in the background in relation to what I'm going on to say. So, I mean, why do I think that Bulgakov is a particularly remarkable theologian from our point of view today? You know, one of the most remarkable, if not even the most remarkable. Why am I saying that? Well, I think it's partly because although in a sense he says seemingly some very, very novel things, he also avoids extremes in a way. He is a Russian criticizing the West, but he's also a Russian very respectful of the West, also a Russian trying to learn from the West. And for that reason, today in Russia, the so-called neo-patristic orthodoxy, which is quite narrow-minded, tends to be very opposed to the sophiologists. And indeed, Bulgakov is often seen as a heretic. I think this is quite wrong. I think on the contrary, he's a very, very ecumenical figure, right? and that his desire to engage with Western culture should be seen as admirable. I think in another way as well, he wasn't an extremist in that he was very, very critical of modernity. He was very critical of modern philosophy. But it's clear that he didn't think, therefore, you could simply go back to the past, that you could therefore simply recover some kind of pristine, pre-modern mode of thinking. It would be much more accurate to say that he was searching for a kind of alternative modernity. And in that respect, the only way he could do that was by being very, very original as a philosopher. And this, I think, is something that marks him out as well. I can't think of anybody else who was so good at both philosophy and at systematic theology as Sergei Bulgakov. He didn't have to, as it were, borrow his philosophy from somebody else. He did the philosophizing all for himself. And his theology is built on his philosophy, and his theology and philosophy very much form a seamless whole. In fact, there are several passages in Bulgakov where he indicates that he's a kind of philosopher of the Bible, a philosopher of dogma and of the liturgy, more than he is a theologian. But in a way, you could argue that makes him close to how the patristic thinkers saw themselves. You know, remember that Augustine never describes himself as a theologian. He always describes himself as a philosopher and as a Christian philosopher. So there's a sense there with Bulgakov that he's on that kind of primordial level to a patristic thinker. And I think there are other reasons for saying that as well. One reason is that he's trying to do justice to elements in the Bible that maybe even the fathers never did justice to. So all the material around wisdom and all the material that seems to talk about some kind of figure of an eternal man, a kind of Adam Kadmon thinker, where Bulgakov is very prepared to learn from Jewish thought, despite the fact that the worst thing about Bulgakov, I'll just say it straight out, is he is not sufficiently tolerant towards the Jewish faith in relation to Russia. That's the black mark against Bulgakov, and it has to be said right up front. But nonetheless, and maybe this makes it worse, he did learn a lot from Jewish thinking about the Bible. He's also at this kind of very primal level in the sense that while he's very, very orthodox, he's very prepared to to think about where orthodoxy might not be adequate, it might not have gone far enough. And that's especially, as we'll see, in relation to questions about what is the relationship between essence and personhood, both in relation to Trinity and in relation to Christology and in relation to the doctrine of creation. Finally, another way in which we can say that Bulgakov is a very generous kind of thinker is his attitude towards modern philosophy. He's not really saying, as some people say, well, you know, once Christianity is abandoned, once we've got secular thought, everything goes wrong. On the contrary, he's very, very alert to the post-Christian elements in modern philosophy. Maybe you can think of a parallel here to some things that Tom Holland has said in Dominion, his book Dominion, that, you know, an awful lot of things that are post-Christian, when you look at them, remain incredibly Christian. And this was one reason why Bulgakov took sort of Western, more secular culture quite seriously, and in particular, German culture. So in what ways did Bulgakov see Western, modern, semi-secular philosophy as nonetheless still quite Christian? Well, I think we can mention three things. First of all, the focus on the subject that we get in Descartes and then in Kant and then in Fichte, who is very, very important for Bulgakov. This kind of beginning with the subject, trying to have a more subjectively based philosophy, which Bulgakov associates with the Christian turn towards the person, and even with the Eastern stress on the so-called monarchia of the father, the idea of the father as the supreme person. Secondly, he thinks that the way the West takes more seriously life in this world, above all, it takes the world of nature and science very seriously compared to Russian otherworldliness. He thinks that this is connected with the doctrine of the incarnation. And finally, he thinks that because the incarnation is the incarnation of the logos, of reason, you can't just dismiss the Western interest in reason and logic either. However, in his astonishing book, The Tragedy of Philosophy, which has just been translated, and I've been lucky enough to do the preface for that, he nonetheless undertakes a critique of Western philosophy, and he sees it as respectively focusing too much on the person, or too much on nature, and too much upon logic. And he takes as his prime examples of this, in particular, German idealism, but it's not confined to that. So he sees Fichte as focusing too much on the subject, Schelling as focusing too much on nature, and Hegel as focusing too much on logic. And to sum up an extremely complicated argument in just a few phrases, Bulgakov's thesis is that philosophy goes wrong because it ignores the doctrine of the Trinity, or at least the Orthodox doctrine of the Trinity. That somehow, if you've got the doctrine of the Trinity, this keeps everything in balance. It's not really possible to understand the whole of reality just out of the subject or just out of the self. You in the end run into all sorts of problems. If you focus just on nature, Spinoza does, or as empiricism does, you'll end up not being able to explain human subjectivity. If you focus just on logic in the way that Hegel and Marx do, you discover that this really can't take account of everything. Not everything fits into some sort of dialectical determinism. So Bulgakov suggests instead that the Trinity keeps a kind of balance between the subject and logic and nature. It keeps a kind of balance between starting with yourself, then looking at your relationships with other people, and then what binds you together and the relationship with nature, because he develops a kind of Trinitarian ontology where the whole of reality is reflecting the doctrine of the Trinity. But above all, he thinks the doctrine of the Trinity keeps a kind of balance between person and essence. So he thinks that a subject naturally expresses itself in terms of things, in terms of the properties of the world. And he associates the second person of the Trinity, especially with the Logos. So you develop your character by sort of growing in your environment, associating with some things more than others, loving some things more than others, and then you build up to loving other people more than others. But then you have the sense that your personhood is a mystery, that it's somehow inexhaustible. And it's precisely because of that you can identify with other people, and then a you becomes a we, and so forth. And we build up to community or to sobornost. But perhaps the most striking thing of all in the tragedy of philosophy is that Bulgakov wants to replace the idea of reading reality in terms of logic with the idea of reading reality in terms of grammar. So his idea of Trinitarian ontology is that somehow the grammar of subject, predicate, and the copula linking the two is the biggest trace of the Trinity in the world. Now, one of the most astonishing things here is that the Catholic priest Antonio Rosmini, who was a philosopher who lived in the 19th century, came to a very, very similar conclusion. And the comparison of these two mighty thinkers, I think, is still awaited. So by grammar, Bulgakov doesn't just mean something like Wittgenstein. He actually thinks that reality itself is structured like a language. He thinks you've got to see the whole of reality in these grammatical terms, in a way that is also interestingly echoed in the thought of Whitehead. Whitehead has a rather similar idea that everything is somehow propositional. So to get to this idea, just to give you a kind of illustration, Bulgakov would say, somewhat following Fichte here, that if you say, well, the table is in the dining room, what you're really saying is, I'm seeing that the table is in the dining room. And by doing that, inevitably, you're seeing the table a bit like a subject, so as a bit like yourself. And there is absolutely no way out of thinking of the world in these kind of terms. And this certainly opens his thought up in a rather vitalist, in a rather panpsychic kind of direction, which I think probably does have a lot of resonances with some of the ways that philosophers are thinking today. Another feature, I think, of this way of looking at things, if you compare it to the personalist thought of somebody like John Zizoulas, is that Bulgakov does way more justice to things. He doesn't scorn things. In a way, he's saying the world consists in persons and in things, and also that there isn't any kind of clear boundary between them. So that he's not simply going back to an old kind of ontology of substance and accidents. He's suggesting that the boundary between a subject and a predicate is a very, very loose one, that a subject just no thing has identity without its qualities. And again, this is very, very Trinitarian, that the Father just doesn't exist without the Son. So on this account of things, the whole of reality becomes a kind of ongoing historical and evolutionary expressiveness. And you can see a great continuity between the human subject and the rest of reality. And really, this isn't very Kantian. You know, Bulgakov is not saying we've got to turn to the subject because we can only be sure of epistemology or of what we know. He's not even turning to something like phenomenology. On the contrary, it's a very realist take on the primacy of the subject. That he's saying, again, a bit like Whitehead, that what goes on inside our heads is fully as real as the things that we see out there, that subjective feelings, subjective emotions, the creative process, these are just as objective as everything out there. It's a bit like the title of a book by Italian Catholic philosopher Michele Sciacca that's called The Objectivity of the Interior. It's precisely like that. It's kind of the subjectivity you find in Socrates or Plato, even maybe Descartes to some extent, in Kierkegaard, but not the subjectivity that you find in Kant, because we're not talking about the subject of knowledge. We're talking much more about a real subjective actor and a sense that everything in reality is to some degree a subjective actor. And you can relate this also to a modern evolutionary thinker like Bruno Latour. But it's just very, very interesting that Bulgakov wants to see it in these Trinitarian terms. And he's suggesting that we mustn't absolutize the human perspective. We mustn't absolutize the perspective of nature. We mustn't imagine there's some kind of impersonal logic uniting the two. On the contrary, the world is a mysterious linkage of all these things because it's not grounded in itself. It doesn't own itself. It's not locked up into immanence. On the contrary, it's a participation in an eternal process. So Bulgakov is, as it were, doing something extraordinary. He's not just saying modern thought is wrong. He's not saying let's go back to older thought, but he is saying let's have a different kind of modern thought. Let's have a more Trinitarian kind of modern thought. Let's do justice to the modern sense that nature is changing and dynamic, that we're historical and linguistic creatures, but let's see how this makes more sense in Christian terms, so that his propositional ontology, if you like to look at it like that, is a very, very original philosophical move, which he thinks nonetheless only makes sense in Trinitarian terms. Now, so I've talked already about the way in which he's trying to criticize modern thought by saying you've got to think in terms of a balance of person and essence, and this is Trinitarian. But I've also indicated how he tends to see the boundary between personhood and essence as rather fluid. And it's in this respect that we have to see him as a doctrinal innovator in some way, that he's troubled about an excessive duality between the person and the essence register. He wants to keep them distinct, but he's also concerned with what might hold them together. So if you think in terms of the Trinity in God, because of divine simplicity, he's anxious to say that there must be something mediating the persons and the essence. And this goes so far that Bulgakov is sometimes prepared rather to turn things around, to suggest that it could be true that there are three essences and one person in the Trinity. It's not as satisfactory as saying, putting it in Orthodox terms, but if you don't see that that's somewhat true, you might get things wrong, seems to be his argument. And above all, he's resisting the idea that the essence in the Trinity is something totally impersonal. It's more like a kind of personifying power, if you like. And equally, he's resisting the idea that the persons in the Trinity are just sort of empty subjective wills that don't have any content of character if you like. On the contrary, it's constantly for him a kind of interplay between the if you like to put it this way, the thinginess of association that gives you a character, and on the other hand, the flexible freedom that specifically persons have. So it's because he wants to say that the essence in the Trinity is not something impersonal, that he talks about it as wisdom, he talks about it as Sophia. Now, it's very clear, and Ron Williams has got absolutely excellent material on this. It's very clear that Bulgakov doesn't really believe that Sophia is a kind of fourth hypostasis. Some of the sophiologists did think in those terms. On the contrary, he doesn't go that far, excuse me, but he doesn't want to see the divine essence as completely impersonal either. As I say, it's a kind of making personal force, just as Bulgakov in this world doesn't really think that there's anything purely dead or anything purely without mind. Even if he's not saying that everything is living and conscious, it's approaching that, if you like, because it is, in his terms, sophiological. So that when it comes to this world, he thinks that this world reflects the Trinity insofar as there is a kind of world soul, which he identifies with wisdom as the first of God's creatures in the wisdom literature in the Old Testament. If you like, it's a bit like Gaia. It's a dynamic, creative, shaping power. So there's one sophionic force, and then there are many, many hypostases, many substances, if you like. But because, as I've said, the substances building up to persons are very fluid, they're always expressing themselves in this predicational way, they are close to this dynamic power that is Sophia. So when it comes to the question of the relationship between God and creation, again, Bulgakov is very interested in, as it were, finding mediations where, in one sense, there can't be a mediation. So he, as with person and essence in the Trinity, in one sense, these are in different registers, but in another sense, he's looking for a point of mediation because he's bothered about unsettling unity. So also when it comes to the division between the creator and the creation, this is an absolute gulf, and Bulgakov is not denying that. But on the other hand, he's also bothered by the idea that there can be something simply extra to God, as if there was another thing alongside God, when God is all in all and God is omnipotent. And there's a very strong sense for him in which reality cannot exist outside God, that at its deepest depths, the creation must be identical with God, as for Augustine. So on the one hand, Bulgakov thinks of creation as being inside God as Sophia, and on the other hand, he thinks of God as being inside creation, again, as Sophia. Sophia is on either side of the divide. She's not hovering in the middle, and yet there is a sense in which she is all one reality. I mean, if you like to put this in the most extreme way, there is a sense in which, in Bulgakov, in which Sophia is bigger than God. And obviously that's something that one has to debate about. There's a sense in which he's saying, well, I'm not a pantheist and I'm not a panentheist, but I'm trying to almost hold those two poles together at the same time, precisely because if God is absolute, if God is the creator of everything, there can't, in a literal, ordinary sense, be something alongside God. You might say that he has a very extreme account of participation. And this sense that almost Sophia, this kind of arch feminine reality, and the Russians very much like to talk about it in these very, very romantic terms, that Sophia is the eternal feminine, a kind of active receptivity that is in God, but very much sort of in the world, holding it all together. He links that also with the notion of the theandric. So the sense that, if God has become incarnate, if he has assumed humanity into himself, then because God is eternal, that must be eternally true. It can't be the case that this is something that God just happened to do as a one-off, as it were. It can't be incidental to God at all. So the theandric must be eternal. And so again, there's almost a sense sometimes in Bulgakov, and he's quite close to Swedenborg or Blake here, that the theandric is almost, again, bigger than God. And obviously that's where he seems to be the most controversial. The sophiology plays a part also in his Christology. And once again, although obviously he's saying that Christ is one person in two natures, it's almost as if he's close to a reversal. That the theandric is one nature, combining the person of the Logos with a universal humanity, such that in Christ, nature and the individual absolutely coincide, but Christ also represents an eternal humanity. So that some of the passages in Paul that are usually interpreted in terms of the incarnation of the Logos, which obviously Bulgakov believes in, he nonetheless interprets as an incarnation of the eternal humanity. And in this way, there are bits in Paul that he can read more literally, where it seems to talk about Christ as being eternally created. So for Bulgakov, the incarnation is at once the incarnation of the Logos and the incarnation of the eternal humanity, of a kind of Adam Kadmon figure. And he has a very, very strong sense that Sophia is the locus of the Platonic ideas, so that in one sense, we're not held as a human race through the generations, we're not held together by an abstract blueprint, but in some sense, there is a kind of archetypal man that we're united with. Again, this isn't a literal hypostasis as with Sophia, but precisely because we're endlessly edging towards this kind of ideal man, we're constantly evolving and changing. And this is the general way he thinks of the relationship between Platonic ideas and dynamic processes going on in time. He again, in the case of Christology, there's this sense of him looking for a mediation where normally there isn't a mediation, and for sort of trying to press orthodoxy to think through its latent paradoxes, to think itself through with a greater amount of philosophic rigor, if you like to put it that way. And this extends to a preparedness, to sometimes slightly flirt with things that might seem a bit Gnostic, to suggest that, well, maybe some Gnostic texts did take passages in the Bible seriously that we don't. So he definitely has a doctrine of the fallen Sophia. So if angels have fallen, if humanity has fallen, if the whole of finite reality is shaped by wisdom, the first created of God's works, then wisdom, Sophia, has also fallen. So that in a sense, the most primary thing in Revelation is to redeem Sophia. And this is, if you like, a work of history. You can only redeem human beings collectively. And this is where, his socialism is very much remaining in place. And for him, what's recounted in the New Testament is, if you like, a kind of incarnation of the divine Sophia coming to redeem the earthly Sophia. So he thinks very strongly in terms of the incarnation belonging to the Jews, to John the Baptist as a forerunner. He's got a whole book about John the Baptist. Above all, to Mary, who's obviously very close to Sophia, and a big stress on the Marian ascent, and a very strong doctrine of the Spirit and the link of the Spirit to the Church. So much so that, without quite saying this, it's almost as if the whole Trinity has descended at the incarnation. And the logic of that would be that, if the second person of the Trinity is only defined by substantive relation, then how can he descend without the Father descending and the Holy Spirit descending? And if that sounds wild, then read Augustine's De Trinitate and see really how close he is to saying something like that. And incidentally, the Augustinian interest in the eternal Jerusalem, or the Caelum Caeli, is an interest which is really central for Augustine, and central in his Psalms, is very close to something like an interest in a Sophia figure. Just as Augustine thinks that we're redeemed by praying the prayer of Christ. We're redeemed by praying the Psalms, which are the prayer of Christ. There's an incredibly powerful sense of the theandric there, if you like, and a very powerful sense of the unity of the Church with Christ, and therefore a strong sense of a kind of descent of the whole of the Trinity. If you like to read Augustine in that way, and also something very close to a kind of theurgic sense. And the word theurgy is incredibly important for Bulgakov. The idea that we only approach God by a liturgical action that God then descends into. If you read Augustine in terms of the centrality of the Psalm commentary, by far his biggest book, you see something that's not so remote from the kind of things that Bulgakov is spelling out much more explicitly. So that for him, if you like, the movement from the Father's manifestation in the Old Testament, that of Christ in the New, the coming of the Spirit in the Church, and the unity of the Spirit with the Church, which he very much sees as Mariological and as linked to Sophia, is all one descent, all one redemptive movement. And I'll conclude by sort of winding with Jesus, because I think that Bulgakov's entire sort of linguistic ontology is linked to this need to defend the Jesus prayer. So basically what he's saying is that names are not just arbitrary, that a name in the widest sense, if you think of yourself apart from the name you were given at baptism, all that's happened to you, all you're associated with, although you'd still be there, there's a sense in which you would not be there at all. And so this is why Bulgakov argues that the whole business of naming in the Bible is incredibly prominent and incredibly linked to the whole business of divine recognition. And there's a sense in which the person is in excess of their name, in the sense that, in the way that the Father is in excess of the Son, but there's another sense in which you're not in excess of your name at all. So we're back to this idea that history is a kind of interplay between personhood and essence, an interplay between things and objects, if you like, that we have a surplus of freedom over things, but we don't have an identity apart from this association with things, which suggests that if we want to treat ourselves well, we need to treat the planet well. That's all. So I'm losing sound here, I think. Not hearing anything, sorry.
We can hear you.
Okay, I can hear you now. Yeah, okay. It was just a blip, I think. Yeah, yeah.
It's okay. I think Father Sam is just struggling with his video for a minute. So, are you with us, Father Sam?
I am, yes.
Excellent.
Trying to start that. Professor, thank you very much for this evening and for all that you have given us and introducing us to this character, which I'm sure for some of us here is our first hearing of him, and clearly a fascinating man, a very deep thinker, and someone who's able to combine multiple disciplines and still make a coherent sense of an argument following all
absolutely
through. And just remarkable. Thank you very much for your talk this evening, for all you've given us in terms of your own knowledge and wisdom of this particular character, and also for spending some time with us this evening. I'm going to just while we're all here, let you know about next week's lecture, which is on Dionysius, and the little blurb that we've got for that speaks about something that's been in the news a bit recently. The Benedict option by Rod Dreher has invited some good comments, but also a lot of criticism about the way in which we might understand our future Christian life together, whether it will be some sort of withdrawal from the world in some big sense. But the speaker for next week asked the question, might Christians not find allies outside of the fold? But next week we look at the 6th century writings of the monk who called himself Dionysius the Areopagite, who was inspired by St. Paul's mission in the marketplace.
You're keeping the theme of the name there. That's good.
Indeed.
We are.
And next week we are delighted to welcome Father Thomas Plant to speak to us, priest, Platonist and prayer book provocateur, who has served in parish ministry, school and cadet force chaplaincy, as well as being a university lecturer. He's a classicist turned theologian and has studied at St Andrews, Bristol and Kent, where he has a doctorate. He compared the metaphysics and soteriology of Dionysius the Areopagite and the Japanese Buddhist Shinran Shonin. So we look forward to welcoming him next week. Actually, I think he's here today as well, listening in, checking out the competition. So welcome to you, Father. And I'm now going to hand over to Father Matthew, who's going to guide us through our questions.
Thank you very much, Father Sam. It's never as straightforward as you think to unmute yourself, is it? You press the button, you think it's unmuted, it's not. Well, you can hear me. I can tell by the giggles. Right, that was stunning. Thank you very much. Huge amounts of reading to do off the back of that. Now, same as usual, everybody, wave your digital hand or wave at me and I will come to you. But our first question is going to be from Father Thomas. Over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Milbank. I promise I'll be better dressed next week. I won't be wearing a caftan. But there we are, evening attire.
I think it's as smart as it gets. I wouldn't worry.
You can see, or I can see, why Bulgakov got into so much trouble. From what it sounds like, especially the idea of a descended and an undescended Sophia, and the equation of the soul with wisdom. It sounds almost like what Plotinus is accusing well, what Porphyry says are the Gnostics in Enneads 2:9 of, you know, quite similar sort of things. And yet I understand, only from a footnote, I'm afraid, that you've written on Bulgakov's use of theurgy. So I'm wondering, does he answer these points, as it were, with iamblichian or Dionysian tropes, and how does he get around, you know, the connotations of theandry, theandric, the word theandric, which did historically raise some Chalcedonian hackles. How does he negotiate that, please?
Yeah, it's a very important question. I mean, he as regards theurgy, yeah, he clearly sees himself as in the tradition of Dionysius and Maximus, and the way they've drawn upon those elements in Proclus and ultimately Iamblichus. But as I said, to get the feel of this with these people, you have to realize, on the one hand, there's all this stuff coming from the fathers. And on the other hand, they're in a kind of chic avant-garde milieu where occultism is always just hovering around, you know. So there's no good beating about the bush about that, because you won't fully follow what they're doing unless. And although, you know, Bulgakov is incredibly cautious about this, nonetheless, you know, there is that kind of element. Of slightly taking sort of natural magic seriously, but you know, he very much doesn't. He wants a re-enchanted world, I suppose you could say. That's very much to the fore, and he's trying to all the time sort of take these patristic themes and link them to things in the wider culture. You know, not to sort of totally dismiss lay culture. You know, the question about the theandric, well, I mean, yeah, I suppose, yes, you know, the danger would be that you would go off and he's the need to avoid that, I think. And he just has a very, very strongly Cyrilline Christology. But it's taken to quite a strong extreme, if you like, to put it that way, and with, yeah, a very sort of powerful insistence, I suppose, that would be in the end something like Origen or John Scotus Erigena, that, you know, everything that God has done is eternal. So, you know, the creation is eternal because it's the eternal act of God. You know, I mean, it will. I mean, in relation to people like Erigena, something quite strange happens, in the sense that in his book, The Unfading Light, the people he writes about in the West are all these slightly edgy figures, you know, like Erigena, Eckhart, Jacob Boehme, the great John Portage, one of the greatest Anglican figures of all time, and he has a whole long section. By the way, a lot of sophiology is really Anglican. It's from the Anglican reading of Boehme in people like Portage. We invented it all. Just need to mention that, because it doesn't really come from Russia at all. So that's just a footnote. But so yeah, on the one hand, he's looking at all these edgy people, and he tends to sort of say, well, this isn't quite orthodox, and then land up doing just the same kind of edgy things himself, and say, oh, this is Russian and Eastern, and so forth. You know, so there's a little bit of tricksiness perhaps occurring there, but it just makes him very interesting.
Thank you very much for that question, for kicking us off. Yeah. Meg, you've got the next question. Just need to unmute yourself, Meg.
Right. Picking up on what you were saying about re-enchantment, the only book by Bulgakov that I've read is the one on angels.
Do you know, that's one I haven't read, so you must tell me.
Right.
Yes.
When I was doing some work, an essay, a study of angels, and I was going to ask you how that fitted in, but if you haven't read it, you haven't read it. Sorry.
Well, he does say something about angels in other works, and I think a bit like Dionysus, he links angels very strongly to names, that sort of these are, angels are theophanies, if you like, just as he thinks of names as being theophanies. And you know, he has a very strong and very realist view of angels, that they are real powers out there in reality.
Oh yes.
No question about that at all. What did you feel was the main thing you got from reading Jacob's Ladder?
I loved the book. Of all the books I was reading at the time, it was the most helpful. I'll just read you virtually the last paragraph. It says,
"Thank you,"
which I marked. The world is sheltered by angel wings. Angel eyes keep watching without rest over us. Between heaven and earth, the holy angels ascend and descend unceasingly. They join with us in our prayers. Angel hosts unceasingly glorify the creator of the worlds. Angels standing before the throne of God live a common life with us and are united by the bonds of love. How great is the joy bestowed on humankind knowing this."
Wonderful. Yeah, it's important to say that Bulgakov, you know, has these long devotional passages. It's you know, it's not all, he can write in several different registers, and the short book Sophia that sums up his thinking is quite an easy book. It's not immensely difficult.
Yeah, well, maybe I could cope with that because I am not a philosopher.
Well, yeah, read. So it tells you a lot about what he does think, and he never makes things unnecessarily difficult, I think, either.
Thank you very much, Meg. I'm going to ask Ivan if he would like to ask his question that he's put in chat. If you'd like to ask that in person, Ivan, over to you.
I am here. Thank you very much indeed. Yes, so I'm taken by two things. One is the idea that we must consider the possibility of three essences in God and God's Trinitarian life. That's very interesting. But also the idea that the fire is bigger than, as it were, God. Is Bulgakov taking us in that direction because he wants to confront us with the mystery that is God, not because he's risking, as it were, the God behind the Trinity, that there's some kind of real essence of God behind Trinity?
No, it's because it's a mystery. Yes.
Yeah, in that mystery is that, as it were, resolves itself in spirit.
I think you know, it's a little bit like Eckhart talking about Gottheit. It's as if he's saying, well, sometimes he'll say there's the absolute, and then we talk about God in relation to us. And so whenever we talk about God, we're thinking about him in relation to us. And ultimately, that's our point of view. So that a negative theology has to say, you know, it has to go beyond that, and somehow the mystery of God, the mystery of the Trinity, if you like, is that God is ecstatic, that God as God is more than God. Right. You know, that God goes out from himself, and he goes out from himself within himself, and his going out from himself is still God. So, I mean, so much in Bulgakov is dealing with that kind of theme. And trying not to sort of lapse back into Hegelianism or into Schelling's position. He's criticizing those positions, and yet often he's close to those kind of problematics, including the question of, you know, what happens in the suffering on the cross in relation to the Trinity. Where he has his own account that's a bit like that of Balthasar, but significantly different as well. But he, you know, he's concerned with the profound problems of, you know, how is there something alongside God? and how is it that God becomes man and suffers in man, and so on. That he totally wants to hang on to divine simplicity and divine absoluteness, but he's not shying away from some of these paradoxes, really. And so Sophia is very much the name of the mystery of you know, how is it that there is the creation as well as God.
I was just wondering whether he would apply the category of the hypostatic to Trinitarian being. Well,
yeah, no, he's I mean, he's totally orthodox in one sense, but you know, that there are three hypostases and there is one essence. But as I say, that he's sometimes trying to say, well, it's not as if there are completely new hypostases in relation to the hypostasis of the Father. You know, it's as if the Father is sort of repeated in the Son and the Spirit, without, you know, without sort of slipping into a modalism, if you like.
Yeah.
And I think all the time he's suggesting that, you know, after all, you know, these terms like ousia, hypostases, originally they all almost meant the same thing. And he's saying, well, don't imagine that we have too absolute an understanding of their contrast, if you like. In a way, he's being cautious about that. And as I say, above all, he does not like the idea that the essence is something completely impersonal, as if, you know, what held God together was something impersonal. No, it's something entirely personal.
Thanks very much for that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Terrific, thank you. We're going to go to Rev Ashley next.
Yes,
yeah, thanks, Tony. That's correct. Yeah.
Hello, Professor Milbank. I don't know if you can hear me.
Yes. Hi, Ashley.
Yes. Sorry. Hope I'm just a poor seminarian, so I hope I'm not wading into things beyond my depth, or rather.
Well, that's called theology.
Yes. Right. I sort of had two. The first is not really a question. It's more something that struck me. I first came across Bulgakov in March. Actually, I managed to get down to Cambridge for the New Trinitarian Ontologies Symposium, and the one of the speakers mentioned his paper was on Bulgakov, and you mentioned in his thinking. Links with Rosmini and notably Wittgenstein and Whitehead in terms of language, reality as language. And it struck me, there's a sort of parallel there with, and again, you mentioned Bulgakov sort of moving in esoteric circles, the Sefer Yetzirah of the Kabbalistic school,
yes,
with the Hebrew alphabet as literally the the creation of the world.
Yes. Well, Bulgakov's very interested in the Kabbalah, no question.
Yes. Yeah. That sort of thought had me, I mean, that ties in, as far as I know, with the sort of postmodern, you know, Lacan and all these chaps. Is there maybe I'm stating the obvious, there seems to be a fruitful dialogue there.
Absolutely. I think that, for example, when Lacan makes the contrast between the subject of a statement and the subject of an enunciation. In other words, it's when he's making a difference between the grammatical subject and the speaking subject, that's exactly the sort of thing that Bulgakov is thinking about. He's really saying it's never the case that you can be a pure living subject without also being a linguistic subject. But there's a kind of interplay going on between those two.
Yes.
And yes, so, I mean, on the one hand, he's got a very, very mystical doctrine. So, for example, he thinks that names are kind of prior to to structures. He's, in that sense, it's very post-structuralist, that he's saying that a name is prior to grammatical structures. And this is why a word can kind of shift between being a noun, an adjective, a verb, and so on, because names are somehow primary theophanic realities. They're very close to disclosure of divine ideas, and he's interested in Plato's Cratylus and the idea that words are somehow not completely arbitrary in some sense. So
yes,
in one sense there's this very mystical aspect, and yet you also there's a very rigorous aspect that he's really picking up on people like Hamann and Herder and Humboldt, German linguistic theorists who were criticizing Kant for not having taken language properly into account. So that they suggested that the way that Kant wants to sort of divide between our categories of thought and on one hand and empirical information from the senses on the other, ignores language, because we arrived too late to do that. Language has already mixed up our mind with the world, and we can't undo it. So that we don't have any access to the world as kind of items, raw items that aren't already predicates for us.
Yes.
You know? So there's something incredibly sophisticated about Bulgakov's philosophy of language, besides this sort of very, very mystical aspect. And again, I think there's something very Oriental here, very, very East Christian here. You know, it's more like the Far Orient. You know, it's more like the Indians. You know, that they can combine something very mystical with something very, very rational.
Yes. And sorry, if I may, my last question is kind of linked into this. Within his own tradition, Bulgakov was condemned, as far as I'm aware. There was a synod that condemned him as heretical. How, in the light of Orthodox Christianity, with a small o, how do we engage with his thought if his own tradition
there are still people in Moscow at St. Tikhon's University that take the sophiologists very seriously. And by the way, they're the only university in Russia that isn't corrupt. It's pretty important. And you know, I mean, if you know anything about Russian Orthodoxy and if you know English Orthodox, they will tell you it's, you know, the contemporary scene is a nightmare in which Orthodoxy is so close to nationalism.
Yes.
Basically, the exiled theologians, people like Bulgakov, Berdyaev, Losky, and so forth, developed a thought much more independent of the state. They developed a much more independent ecclesiology, and really they developed a very, very fruitful dialogue between Russian tradition, Orthodox tradition, and the West. And unfortunately today, a lot of that's been lost. And I think the political parallels are not very comforting, to be frank. I mean, so-called neo-patristic orthodoxy, which, by the way, is often, you know, it thinks it's being very true to the fathers and so on, but it's not necessarily the case that they're true to the fathers. The Bulgakov's incredibly creative relationship to the fathers, and you know, I mean, there will be a lot of reasons for saying that what Bulgakov is saying is not so remote from, say, what Maximus the Confessor is saying. And I know several people in Greece, for example, contemporary Greek Orthodox, who's saying increasingly they think Erugina's reading of Maximus is an accurate one. It's not wild and heterodox. It's just pushing things a little bit further, if you like, in a more paradoxical direction. And but I'm afraid, you know, that in a lot of places, you know, the shutters have come down, and this is why, for me, somebody like Bulgakov is so important. That he's he's not just another liberal. He's not trying to baptize the way we think now, but he's not kind of retreating into a sort of repristinated world or a kind of orthodoxy that never really was, you know, and the neo-patristic orthodoxy is a bit like neo-Thomism in that respect, that
yes.
And as I say, it's not aligned with healthy political forces.
Right.
And so I think it's a real shame, and I don't think it's fair to say Bulgakov was a heretic. He's very careful to remain within the bounds of orthodoxy, but you know, round the edges, there are things. But isn't that true that there are uncertain things round the edges?
Yes. Right. Yes.
You know, it's not a dead thing.
No.
And I mean, one of the most striking things, I think, is just how close both Balthazar and Louis Bouillet are to Bulgakov, really, and sometimes closer than they're saying. And I think that other Catholic thinkers like Klaus Hermele or Piero Coda, a lot of Italians are very, very interested in Bulgakov. Partly, as I say, because Rosmini seems so similar in certain respects.
He's a blessed in the Catholic Church. So
he's so. I think Bulgakov's influence in the West is very alive, and amongst, you know, some Orthodox in the West. I mean, certainly somebody like David Bentley Hart, contemporary Orthodox theologian, is absolutely huge admirer of Bulgakov.
Thank you very much.
Not at all. Thanks.
Okay, let's go to Father Gustav now.
Thank you. I've been wondering, you mentioned in the beginning, Professor, that he saw himself as a philosopher and not a theologian. And as a philosopher myself, it's quite differently how we approach answering the same kind of questions, even if we have the same faith in the background. So how would he define the different disciplines?
Well, as I said, you know, he came from a Russian world in which there wasn't really our kind of distinction between philosophy and theology. But he talks about himself sometimes as a philosopher of dogma. And by dogma, he means something like the Bible, liturgy, and the doctrines of the church insofar as they've become part of that liturgical process, part of the doxology, if you like. So one of his claims in relation to philosophy, and here again, I think he's really going back to Jacobi, is one of his claims is that philosophy is always dependent on religion, so that you know, that we always begin to think with some kind of mythical religious background, and only later do we come to philosophical reflection. So that he understands that there's a lot of modern philosophy trying to escape from that. In other words, trying to begin with pure reason, the kind of thing we might today talk about as foundationalism. And he doesn't simply disrespect that, not at all. He sees that as a useful exercise, but he thinks it's precisely a tragic exercise, because he thinks that by trying to start on pure foundations, you will eventually run into aporias. You will eventually run into completely irresolvable problems that can only be solved at a more mythical and a more religious level. So he would argue, say, that Plato has to return to myth to make sense of some things, and he thinks, of course, that if you like, Christianity offers us the true myth, and is able to reveal why philosophy is stuck, if you like. So that he, in some sense, he develops a kind of theological critique of philosophy, but also sometimes he suggests that he's as much a philosopher of dogma as he is a theologian of dogma. I think the most useful thing to say is that he doesn't really make those distinctions that would seem to be natural to us, or at least to some of us. But you know, historically, of course, you know, the modern division of theology and philosophy is something very modern, something very particular, and so forth.
Yes, of course, it's very modern.
I mean, also when you think, and all the thinkers he's debating with, are, you know, people like Hegel and Schelling are trying to take philosophical account of revelation. They're trying to, if you like, swallow it in terms of reason, but they nonetheless think that they do have to take account of religion, that religion, if you like, is a stuttering kind of philosophy, so that even what Fichte and Hegel and Schelling are doing is really very different from, you know, what a lot of modern philosophy might think it's doing. Anyway, sorry, I don't know whether that answers your question. But
no, yes, that's
those
perfect.
are a few thoughts. Yeah.
David, you asked a question in chat. Would you like to ask it in person? Just need to unmute yourself, David. There we go.
Oh, that's better. Thank you. Now I've gone and lost my question, which is rather bright. Now,
well, you're there, David. Hi.
I'll make it up as I go along. Bulgakov is not just on his own in the Silver Age, because there are all sorts of people around,
Yeah,
I guess,
right.
Frank,
Yes.
and a very distinguished layperson. And how does Bulgakov really relate to the emigre community, which was first of all chucked out of St. Petersburg and Moscow, and ended up in Paris after going to Berlin and all that sort of thing?
Yes.
Because the way the Orthodox philosophy, as it were, comes through, in a sense, hasn't really been spelt out. And the tradition that S.L. Frank followed through hasn't really been picked up. Has it?
No, less so, and I'm sure you know much more about those than I do. I mean, I think, like all immigrants, they were always fighting each other, weren't they? I mean,
oh yes, yes.
They were always at loggerheads. But I mean, I know about, you know, the main tension between Bulgakov on the one hand and Florovsky and Losky on the other hand. So that Florovsky and Losky much more wanted a kind of patristic purism. But and I think, you know, Rowan Williams would agree, and he wrote his thesis on Losky, that actually Losky landed up sort of projecting onto the fathers, you know, a more extreme apophaticism than was there. And that a lot of what Losky, interesting things Losky says about personhood, in fact, owe far more to Western philosophy than he's letting on. So in that sense, Bulgakov, you could say, is the more honest thinker. But already we have, you know, the seeds of, you know, what I've been talking about with neo-patristic orthodoxy. Already there's a great suspicion that, you know, Bulgakov is too eclectic, he's not very orthodox. But then, as it were, to Bulgakov's left, we've got Badaev. And Badaev is much more inclined to talk about Sophia as a fourth hypostasis and to bring on board much more Gnostic kind of elements, and he's kind of political anarchist as well, where Bulgakov's more socialist. So I know about those tensions. I don't really know much about Frank at all. So you tell me.
Oh well,
I should do.
It's the thesis I never got round to writing.
Oh, that's right. You must write it. Yeah. Do you know Russian?
Yes, I did my first degree in Russian.
Oh well, no, you should. It's a rare ability, so which I don't have. So you should definitely exploit it. Yeah, no question.
Yes, but once I've been retired 10 years and I haven't managed it yet.
Well, yeah, no, I know just what you mean. Making yourself do things is so hard.
Thank you, David.
Yeah.
And we'll go now to Richard, who has the next question.
Hello, and thank you very much for that talk.
Hi, Richard.
Hi, I'm afraid my question's rather more lowbrow and generic than anybody else's, which was really that we've heard a lot about Bulgakov and his importance both as a philosopher and a theologian. Firstly, really, why do you think he's sort of still relatively unknown as a theologian and philosopher? And secondly, if people were asking about Bulgakov and wanting to get into his thoughts and his writings, where would you recommend that they start?
Well, I'll start backwards. I would definitely start with Rowan Williams' selection of translations, because he has a lot of helpful introductions. But there are several helpful introductory books, and then there are ways of directly plunging in. As the book Sophia is not very long, and that can be read quite easily. And also his book called The Philosophy of Economy, where I didn't say so much about his economic thinking, but again, that's not very long, and it's a good way of getting into it. I think increasingly there are a lot of people interested in Bulgakov. There are, if you look at sort of Cambridge, Oxford, American universities, definitely there are more and more people studying him. And I think, why is he not very popular? Well, I think, the whole scene of theology has kind of changed enormously since the 1970s, and there used to be basically in the West, it was split up between Protestant and Catholic theology, and Anglicans tended to read both, but they didn't tend to read Orthodox theologians, I think. And you had sort of vast empires around Karl Barth and Karl Rahner, and then people tended to read German Protestant theologians an awful lot, and something like Bulgakov would have been sort of on the much more exotic margins. And I think so when Rowan Williams learnt Russian and did his thesis in Oxford in the 70s on Losky, that was seen as really a wild move. Why is kind of the most promising theologian of his generation, what people were saying, so, why is he doing this? This looks crazy. But on the contrary, with hindsight, that was to see, I think, the kind of thing that happens next. And I think something I said earlier, I think that increasingly people have got interested in the Nouvelle Theology, that sort of the interest in Barth and Rahner has moved away towards interest in Balthasar and de Lubac. And so the sense that there isn't a big division between nature and grace, the sense that there isn't a natural end separate from a supernatural end. that these are integrated, and that we need to have an integrated discourse. And once you've sort of made that move within Catholic thought, which is very much linked to going back to the Church Fathers and going back to a more authentic version of Thomas Aquinas, once you've done that, it's kind of obvious to see, well, the East just never had those kind of issues, that they were always trying to develop a more integrated discourse. And even now, I think, habitually, when we read, say, Augustine's Confessions, we sort of say, oh, that bit's philosophical, oh, that bit's biblical. And we have to realize that probably wasn't in Augustine's mind at all. That he just thought in terms of wisdom, and he thought that philosophers were a source of wisdom and the Bible was a sort of source of wisdom, and that philosophers often had their stories and their sacred oracles, and there was a lot of philosophy in the Bible, so that in some ways, we're kind of recovering that kind of sense that, because there can be philosophy in narratives anyway, we're not seeing that sort of huge gap, if you like, between reading the Bible and lo and behold, it's often secular philosophers like Badiou or Gambon who've discovered that you can take the New Testament with deep philosophical seriousness, and sort of we've had to kind of relearn that, if you like. So that I think that for a long, if you went back 40 years, what Bulgakov was doing would seem strange, exotic, outside the norms of assumptions of Western theology, above all sort of outside any very Teutonic concern with method. It just looks all over the place. But nowadays, we're kind of more at ease with that, I think.
Thank you very much for your responses to those questions, and indeed thank you very much to all who have asked them to further our conversation and engagement this evening with this fascinating individual. All that's left for me is to say, please do join us again next week for Father Thomas Plant on Dionysius, and have a very good evening. And Professor, thank you once again for being with us this evening.
No, been a real pleasure. Thank you all for coming. Thank you. Have a good evening.
You too.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Good night. God bless.
Good night and God bless.